St. John's Hospital, Santa Monica, California, December 10, 1964. Nat King Cole lay in the recovery room after 7 hours of surgery. Dr. Robert Kosacek, the thoracic surgeon, sat beside the bed waiting for Nat to fully wake from anesthesia. The surgery had not gone as hoped. They'd removed the left lung as planned. But when they opened Nat's chest cavity, they found what they'd feared. The cancer had spread beyond the lung tissue, lymph nodes. Chest wall, inoperable locations. Dr. Kosacek had removed what he could, closed the incision, and now had to tell a 45-year-old man that he was dying. Nat's eyes opened slowly, focused, found the doctor. How bad? His voice was raspy from the breathing tube. Dr. Kosacek had delivered this news before. It never got easier. We removed the left lung, but the cancer has metastasized to areas we can't surgically access. The lymph nodes, possibly the chest wall. Nat closed his eyes, breathed carefully with his remaining lung, opened them again. How long? 6 months to a year, maybe longer with aggressive treatment. But Nat, I need to be honest with you, the spread is significant. Nat nodded slowly, absorbing, processing. Then, I want to tell my family, my fans, people should know. Of course. That's your choice entirely, though you might want to wait until you're stronger to make public statements. I'll wait a few days, but people have a right to know. They've supported me my whole career. Dr. Kosacek squeezed Nat's shoulder, left him to rest, to begin the impossible work of accepting mortality. What neither of them knew was that Capitol Records was about to make that acceptance much harder. Before we dive into how Capitol Records threatened Nat King Cole on his deathbed to keep his terminal cancer diagnosis secret, how they extracted final recording sessions from a dying man to protect their Christmas album sales, and how they controlled his medical privacy until the day he died, let me ask, where are you watching from? Drop a comment, because this story about corporate profit over human dignity is as relevant in 2026 as it was in 1964. The news of Nat's surgery reached Capitol Records within hours. Not from Nat, he was still in recovery. But hospitals had staff had contacts, contacts talked. By December 11, Alan Livingston, Capitol's president, knew that Nat King Cole had undergone major surgery and that the prognosis was poor. Livingston immediately called an emergency meeting with Capitol's legal team and artist relations department. The concern wasn't Nat's health, the concern was Capitol's revenue. Nat has 3 albums scheduled for release in the next 6 months, Livingston explained. We've got the Christmas album that's selling right now. We've got the spring release. We've got tour dates booked through summer 1965. If news gets out that he's terminally ill, all of that is at risk. Stan Cavan, Capitol's head of artist relations, understood the assignment. What do you want me to do? Talk to him, make sure he understands that public disclosure could be problematic for everyone. He's in the hospital recovering from major surgery. You want me to pressure him now? I want you to manage the situation before it becomes a crisis. Stan Cavan visited St. John's Hospital on December 13, 1964, 3 days after Nat's surgery. Nat was sitting up in bed, still weak, still processing his diagnosis. Maria was there holding his hand. Cavan knocked on the doorframe, entered with practiced sympathy. Nat, Maria, I'm so sorry about what you're going through. How are you feeling? I've been better, Stan. Nat's voice was weak but direct. But I'm dealing with it. That's good. That's really good. Listen, I don't want to intrude on your recovery, but there's something we need to discuss. About the surgery, about disclosure. Maria's grip on Nat's hand tightened. She sensed what was coming. Capitol is concerned about how news of your surgery might affect your career, your album sales, your tour commitments. We think it might be best if we manage the information carefully, maybe keep the details private for now. Nat stared at him. Stan, I have cancer. I just had my lung removed. People are going to notice when I can't perform. Of course, but there's a difference between saying you're recovering from surgery and saying you're terminally ill. The first one people understand. The second one, it changes how they see you, changes their willingness to buy albums from someone who might not be around to promote them. You want me to lie? I want you to protect your legacy and your family's financial security. Your contract with Capitol includes provisions about professional conduct and public image. If you make statements that materially harm Capitol's commercial interests, we could argue breach of contract. The threat was subtle but clear. Nat caught it immediately. You're threatening to void my contract. Because I want to tell the truth about being sick. I'm not threatening anything. I'm explaining the business reality. Capitol has invested heavily in your career. We have scheduled releases, tour commitments. If those fall through because of premature disclosure, there are financial consequences. Maria spoke up, her voice cold. He's dying, Stan, and you're talking about album sales. I'm talking about making sure Nat's family is taken care of. His royalty payments depend on his contract remaining in good standing. If Capitol has grounds to claim breach, those payments could be delayed, tied up in legal disputes. Do you really want that fight while dealing with medical treatments? Nat understood the game. Capitol was holding his family's financial future hostage. Agree to silence or face contract litigation that could freeze his assets while he was dying. How long do you want me to stay quiet? As long as possible, until it becomes absolutely necessary to disclose. By then, the albums will have sold. The tour dates will have been filled with other artists. Capitol's commercial interests will be protected. And if I refuse, Cavan stood, adjusted his jacket, then we'll have to review your contract compliance very carefully. I hope it doesn't come to that, I really do. Get well soon, Nat. He left. The room felt smaller, darker. Maria was shaking with rage. He can't do that. He can't threaten you while you're in a hospital bed. He just did. Nat's voice was flat, defeated. And he's right about the contract. Capitol's lawyers wrote it. They know every loophole, every clause they can weaponize. So what do we do? We do what we have to do to protect you and the girls. I stay quiet. The silence that followed was agreement and surrender. Nat was discharged from St. John's Hospital on December 20, 1964. The hospital released a statement. Mr. Cole underwent successful surgery for a minor lung condition. He is recovering well and expects to return to his schedule in the new year. Every word was technically true and completely misleading. Nat did recover from the surgery itself. His body healed. He could breathe with one lung. He regained enough strength to move around, but the cancer was still there, still spreading. The doctors had started radiation treatments, hoping to slow the progression, but everyone involved knew it was palliative, not curative. Nat's fans had no idea. The Christmas album sold well. Capitol's investment in holiday promotion paid off. Radio stations played the Christmas song on repeat. Families bought the album for their collections. No one suspected the singer was dying. In January 1965, Capitol contacted Nat about a recording session. He'd been home from the hospital less than a month. He was undergoing radiation therapy. He was weak, in pain, struggling to adapt to breathing with one lung, and Capitol wanted him in the studio. We need to record the tracks for the spring album, the producer explained. We've got studio time booked, musicians scheduled. If we don't record now, we'll miss the release window. I just had major surgery. I can barely sing. We'll work with what you can do, short sessions, frequent breaks. But Nat, we need these tracks. The contract specifies delivery dates. There it was. Again, the contract, the leverage, the threat. Nat agreed to try. The recording sessions in January 1965 were painful to witness. Musicians who worked with Nat during that time later described him as a shadow of himself, weak, struggling for breath, having to sit rather than stand at the microphone because standing exhausted him. But he sang, take after take, until Capitol had usable recordings. The album those sessions produced was Love, released in May 1965. 3 months after Nat's death, Capitol marketed it as a beautiful final gift from a legendary artist. They didn't mention they'd extracted those recordings from a dying man who could barely breathe, who was in pain, who needed rest and treatment, not studio sessions. They just sold the albums. By late January 1965, Nat's condition was deteriorating rapidly. Radiation wasn't working. The cancer was progressing. He was losing weight, losing strength. Maria begged him to stop pretending, to tell the public, to let people know what was happening so they could send their love and support. But Nat was trapped by Capitol's threat. If he disclosed now, they could argue he'd breached the contract by failing to fulfill his recording and promotional obligations. They could tie up his royalties in litigation. Leave Maria and the girls fighting for money while he died and after. So he stayed silent and kept deteriorating. On February 15, 1965, Nat King Cole died at St. John's Hospital in Santa Monica. He was 45 years old, 67 days after his surgery, 2 months and 5 days. Within hours of his death, Capitol Records released a statement. With deep sadness, we announce the passing of Nat King Cole after a courageous battle with lung cancer. courageous battle, as if they hadn't spent those 67 days forcing him to hide it, as if they hadn't threatened his family's financial security to keep him quiet, as if they hadn't extracted recording sessions from a dying man. The public was shocked. Nat King Cole was dead, from cancer. When did that happen? Most of his fans had no idea he was even sick. The last they'd heard, he'd had successful surgery for a minor lung condition and was recovering well. Now he was gone, and Capitol was releasing albums he'd recorded while dying. The media coverage focused on the tragedy of losing such a talented artist, the legacy he'd left, the music that would live on. Almost no one asked, why didn't we know he was dying? Why was this kept secret until he was gone? Capitol controlled the narrative, positioned themselves as the grieving record label honoring their beloved artist's memory. Released the LOVE album with touching liner notes about Nat's final gift to his fans. They never mentioned the hospital room threat, the contract coercion, the forced recording sessions, the calculated decision to prioritize album sales over a dying man's right to honesty with his audience. Years later, people who knew what happened began to talk. The musicians from the January 1965 sessions, the hospital staff who saw Stan Cavan's visit, Maria Cole, who eventually felt safe enough to share the truth. They described a system where Capitol Records treated Nat King Cole's terminal illness as a PR problem to be managed rather than a human tragedy deserving compassion, where a record label threatened breach of contract to control a dying man's medical privacy, where final recording sessions were extracted from someone who needed rest and palliative care, not microphone time, where profit mattered more than dignity. The legal analysis is clear. Capitol probably couldn't have successfully sued for breach of contract based on Nat disclosing his illness. Medical privacy is a protected right. Public disclosure of a terminal diagnosis wouldn't constitute breach of professional conduct clauses. But Nat didn't know that, or if he did, he couldn't risk it. Couldn't risk leaving Maria to fight a legal battle while grieving. Couldn't risk his daughter's inheritance being frozen in litigation. So Capitol's bluff worked, the threat succeeded, and Nat stayed silent until he died. The LOVE album sold well. Capitol made substantial profit from those final recordings. The Christmas album continued selling year after year. Capitol's commercial interests were fully protected. All it cost was Nat King Cole's right to face death with honesty, his ability to say goodbye to his fans, his chance to control his own narrative in his final days. Small price, apparently, for corporate profit margins. When Maria Cole spoke about this later, her anger was quiet but absolute. They took his voice when he was dying, not his singing voice, his actual voice. His right to speak his truth. They threatened us until he agreed to lie, and then they acted like they were honoring him. That's what makes this story particularly cruel. Capitol didn't just exploit Nat's illness. They framed their exploitation as tribute, released the albums he'd recorded while dying as final gifts, marketed his silence as protecting his legacy when really they were protecting their sales figures. The broader music industry largely ignored this story. It was uncomfortable. It raised questions about how labels treated dying artists, whether contracts gave labels too much control over artists' private lives and medical information. Easier to focus on the music, the legacy, the beautiful final album. Easier to not ask how that album got made, what it cost the man who made it. Today, this kind of coercion would face more scrutiny. Medical privacy laws are stronger. Artist advocacy is more robust. Social media would make it harder to hide a terminal diagnosis for months. But in 1964-1965, Capitol Records had the power, had the contract leverage, had the ability to threaten a dying man's family into silence, and they used it. Nat King Cole's final 67 days have been his own time with family, time to say goodbye, time to face death with whatever dignity and honesty he chose. Instead, they were Capitol's, controlled, managed, exploited for commercial gain until the moment he died. That's not honoring an artist. That's using them until they're gone, then profiting from their memory while erasing the truth of how they were treated. The LOVE album remains a beautiful recording. Nat's voice, even weakened by illness, carries emotional depth. But knowing how those sessions happened, knowing he was forced into the studio while dying, threatened with contract breach if he disclosed his condition, extracted for profit when he needed rest, changes how it feels to listen. Every note becomes evidence, not just of artistry but of exploitation. Capitol Records never apologized. Never acknowledged the coercion, never admitted they'd threatened a dying man's family to protect album sales. They just kept selling the music, keep selling it today. LOVE is still in print, still generates royalties, and the story of how it was made remains mostly unknown. That's perhaps the final injustice. Capitol got away with it completely, made their profit, protected their interests, and emerged with their reputation intact as the label that nurtured Nat King Cole's brilliant career, when the truth is they threatened him on his deathbed, controlled his medical privacy, extracted final recordings he should never have been pushed to make, and marketed his silence as protecting his legacy. Nat King Cole deserved better, deserved the right to face death honestly, to tell his fans goodbye, to rest in his final days instead of performing for Capitol's release schedule. He deserved dignity. Instead, he got a contract threat in a hospital room and a studio microphone when he could barely breathe. That's the real story of Nat King Cole's final album. Not a beautiful farewell gift, a coerced extraction from a dying man who couldn't refuse without endangering his family. Capitol Records made sure of that.